Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today for Whatever Happened to the American Dream. I'm so excited with this webinar. Bob Mackinnon is definitely someone special and has created a really valuable and exciting, interesting, fun webinar for all of us. Before we get started, let's go ahead and do a poll. So our first poll today is asking you where you're joining us from. It's always fun to know where our audience is. We've had people on these webinars from Germany and China and I can't remember every place. Iceland. Okay, so we have people either also from Canada today and maybe some other countries if they fill in the question box and tell us which ones. Okay, so the majority of you have voted, and I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. If you want to get in at the last moment, go ahead, and then I'll close this poll and I will share it with you. And you can see that mostly we are from the South and the Midwest today. And some people from either Canada or out of the country. So thank all of you, wherever you are, for joining us. And for those of you who are new to financial social work, we will just tell you a little bit about us and our work before turning this over to Bob. So what's so important about financial social work is that we know and understand that financial health is about more than dollars and cents. This means that it's our relationship with our money and with ourselves, whether it's our client or we professionals. And that's what drives our behavior. Our behavior is how we earn, spend, save, share, and borrow money. And those are the components that contribute to our and our clients' financial circumstances. And you can see my little dancing arrow tells you this is where change happens. It's a requirement. It's about creating sustainable long-term financial behavioral change. And it's about self-awareness, self-confidence, self-acceptance. If we don't feel good about ourselves, then we're not likely to take the time or make the time to create a better financial future. And again, it's about our behavior, how we earn, spend, save, share, and borrow. Okay, so this is what we call our whole person financial health model, because it is about so much more than money, our financial health. It's about our relationship with ourselves and with our money. It's about our financial behavior. It's about our relationships with the other significant people in our lives, what they role model, what they believe, and how much of that we emulate. It's about society in general. And of course, there is a strong life cycle component and health, mental health, emotional health, physical health. All of these are a part of financial wellness. And this is just a very quick look at the financial life cycle model that we use, talking about the fact that very early in life, children should be exposed to money, and by preteens, there should be very clear discussions about money. Adolescence is hands-on and experiential living on up through the life cycle. So our model of financial social work is ongoing, highly experiential, and it is, as you've already learned, a behavioral model that incorporates financial education, motivation, validation, and support. It is interactive, introspective, and strengths-based, works well individually or with groups. And for those who practice financial therapy, we incorporate a transformational learning and a trans-theoretical model of behavioral change. It is an essential part of our model and our work. And always like to discuss the fact that dollars and cents do not make financial choices. It's our inner money self that makes those choices. You could take a moment and introduce yourself to your inner money self and learn from that inner money self. So financial circumstances originate from within the money self, and that money self includes your thoughts, feelings, and actions with your money and with yourself. We talk a lot about financial healing, which precedes financial well-being. It requires addressing the emotional, physical, mental, and psychological damage and challenges of financial problems. And then we like to move on to greater financial well-being. And while there are numerous definitions for financial well-being, ours is to embrace the financial component of your life so money is not a constant concern and stressor, and feeling and being more in control of your money and your life. It requires that healthier money self, because someone who is a healthier person is engaged more readily, is more hopeful, is more eager to change, and more prepared to succeed. So this is just one of my favorite graphics, because to me she represents being at peace with money. And now we are ready to turn this over to our very special guest speaker, Bob Mackinnon, who is president of Galewell Design and does really wonderful, exciting work. And you can now learn from him. Okay, let me go back and hand it over to Bob. Okay, here we go.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to talk to you about our work around the American dream. And with the introduction we saw, we know that so much of the dream is tied into our financial well-being and how we think about that. I want to start with what I think we would all acknowledge that relates to sort of opportunity in this country. And if you see this cartoon, it reads, "For fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree." And we know that all things are not created equal, and the opportunities to climb that tree are in fact difficult and more challenging for some more than others. But at the same time, we know that it does happen, that people do sometimes rise from the lowest level in society to the highest. And then when they get there, they think and act differently. And what I want to do today is to sort of talk a little bit about our exploration around how people think about the American dream, what contributes to it, the psychology of it, and how that changes as we move through our lives, and specifically how we can help shape and frame a better conversation around it. So I want to start with this sort of question that maybe you've asked yourselves, maybe your clients have asked, certainly I have, and full disclosure, this is a picture of me when I was much younger. And, you know, I was born in a situation outside of Boston, in a town that still sort of suffers from poverty, raised by a single mom who was a bartender, and with my brother and sister. So three of us in a poor community outside of Boston. And by all measures, statistically, I'm not supposed to be here. I'm not supposed to be college educated. I'm not supposed to be living in the community I'm living in right now. I'm not supposed to have the wealth that I have. You know, there just are a whole host of things that I currently possess in my own life that statistically are just not, unfortunately, what most people would be at. So I've constantly sort of asked myself this question: well, how did I end up here? what factors contributed to where I ended up in life, and how is that even different from my brother and my sister who have had different trajectories and different sort of life experiences. So, in a lot of the work that we do working with nonprofits and foundations, we see that there is this incredible sort of narrative around the American dream, that if you come here and you work hard, you can make it. But so much of that conversation is centered around sort of individual effort and not around a lot of the other factors that we know are important. So one of the first things we did is we went around the country, we talked to people about the American dream and what they thought contributed to it. We did a national survey, which I'm going to share some results momentarily with you. And I'm going to ask you to also sort of participate. So if I had to ask you this question of what you think is most essential for achieving the American dream, which of these five, and they were five of I think 30 different sort of factors that we asked, contribute. So if you could take a minute, if you see the poll, and you could sort of vote and you sort of put your ideas, and I'll give you guys a couple of minutes to do this. And it was really fascinating. We went around the country, we asked people sort of what they thought contributed to the American dream and what was essential, and how much commonality there was in terms of, regardless of your political views or your age, there was at the top factors, and how much it changed actually when we got to some of the factors that were maybe seen as less essential. So I'll give the poll one more second, and I'll sort of close it, and then I'll share the results of what Americans told us when we asked them this question. And what was fascinating in going around the country, and one of the things I will come out throughout the course of this talk, is how personal this conversation is about people's dreams and what contributes to them, and what was critical to their own journey and what they think is important for others. So I'm going to close the poll now and share the results, and you'll see that according to the attendees here, the number one factor, which is no surprise, strong work ethic with 34% of people. And that was followed by parents who instilled work ethic, a strong community, and then government, and then finally good schools and teachers. Now, what's interesting is that when you look at sort of how this compared to our survey, you'll see that, in this situation, they were allowed to select more than one. 86% of Americans thought that a strong work ethic was critical. It was by far the number one sort of factor. That was followed by parents and adults who, teach good values. Schools was third, and then depending upon political beliefs, we saw a lot of differences. But if it's interesting, if you look at the very bottom and you see things like being well connected to other successful people, or questions about social network, or the role of luck in our lives, or even the role of government, these are things that are seen significantly lower in terms of being perceived as essential. And when you ask yourself sort of like, well, why would this matter? I'm going to launch another poll right here, which is, well, what if you take this from the perspective of which child you think might be more successful? So a 15-year-old from a good family but lacks ambition, or a 15-year-old who has a strong work ethic but comes from an abusive home? And as we ask questions like this, where we gave people choices, and sometimes we differed the age of the child, or we made them choose between, health and education, it was really interesting because it sort of really spoke to a deeper narrative around sort of this topic. And, the theory was that, we do as a country believe, obviously, that we need to work to get where we are. But it's a question of how much that sort of single factor trumps other factors. So I'm going to share the results because they're showing to be pretty consistent right now. And what's pretty remarkable is that you're going to see right here that 70% of you think that a 15-year-old with a strong work ethic but comes from an abusive home will be more successful than a 15-year-old from a good family but lacks ambition. And obviously this wasn't pre-planned, but if you look to see what the country said, you're going to note that it's the exact same number.
Wow.
So definitely, I guess, a representative sample here. Unfortunately, what we know is this actually it contradicts everything we know that research tells us about what the likely outcome would be. People who have come from an abusive home face a tremendous number of barriers for achieving success that strong work ethic in of itself is not sufficient to overcome. And so you see what's at play here, and it's very natural to think, with all the stories that we've been told, and how important sort of this idea of hard work is in our country, and the idea of rags to riches and other kinds of stories we'll talk about shortly, that it is something that we think can truly overcome everything. And as a result, we can look at a school that maybe we know needs fixed, but others can sort of point to one or two children who made it out and say, well, why doesn't everyone work as hard as they do? And so there's less impetus to fix that broken school. So when we sort of think about, how this plays into the stories we tell, whether it's in movies like Rocky or Rudy, stories, books like The Little Engine That Could, it is this idea of individual effort. Maybe sometimes we'll talk about sort of like, Rocky had a trainer or someone who helped inspire him or things like that, but it's largely told through the singular lens of an individual who worked very, very hard. And even if you look at scholarship in books like Outliers from Malcolm Gladwell, who talk about this idea of 10,000 hours. If you practice 10,000 hours at anything, that you will master it. Or more recently, the work that Angela Duckworth does around grit and how we need to sort of try to promote more of that in schools. Again, it's not saying that the idea of grit or practicing a lot or even individual effort is not critical. It's a question of whether it makes it possible or probable to actually be successful. And to understand sort of why we think the way that we do, we need to really try to understand the psychology behind these stories. And ultimately shape and change the story that we tell that is less about sort of, if we think about sort of individual effort, it also brings us to this idea of what one person has versus another. And we compare ourselves, and we basically ground our national conversation around equality or inequity, versus trying to have a conversation around what do we all need for a good life? What do we want our children to have? What do we want our communities to provide? What do we want our government to support? And fortunately, there's a lot of really good science around that, but it first starts with trying to improve the conversation that we're having. So if we think about the psychology of this, there's some interesting work that's been done by a professor at UC Irvine by the name of Paul Piff. And he tries to understand how people in different positions sort of treat each other. And what you see here is basically a simulated game of Monopoly. And in this game of Monopoly, what Piff does is he starts the game by having, these are two players who, are very similar in terms of their political disposition. They're not different in any remarkable ways. So they're sort of equals going in. And the game begins by flipping a coin. And the winner of the coin flip will start with twice as much money, will roll 2 die, will collect twice as much money going around go, and will get to use the Mercedes as their game piece. And the person who doesn't win the coin flip will have half as much money to start, have 1 die, get half as much money going around go, and their game piece is the shoe. And what you see over the course of the game as this goes on is that it starts out sort of nice enough to each other, and ultimately you see the rich player, they're actually sort of moving their game piece around the board and being more demonstrative with the sound that they are recording as their piece hits the board. They're talking to each other differently. So you see this quote here, like, "You're going to lose all your money soon," or "Oh boy, you're really poor." So they treat each other differently. And if you can see at the bottom of that picture, there's even a bowl of pretzels, and have found that the rich player over the course of the game will actually take 17% more pretzels than the poor player, feeling as if they're entitled to a little bit more, or maybe not feeling quite as nervous about the game. What you'll see is that over the course of the game, they also ask at the end of the game, why did you get to where you are? And interesting enough, the player that has won, which is always the person who won the coin flip, never mentions the coin flip. And so the term for that is fundamental attribution bias. This idea that we are naturally, as people, predisposed to think that individual agency is more important than environmental factors. What we also know is how we view our life changes. So Daniel Kahneman of Thinking Fast and Slow sort of has this idea of there are basically two parts of our existence. There is the living self, the life we actually lived, and the remembering self, which is how we remember our life and the stories that we tell and the stories that our parents tell. And these are drastically different. And what that means is that the ways in which we sort of perceive and think about the barriers or the help that we got greatly influences the way in which we move through life. So professors at Cornell and at the New School did some research that basically, and if you think about this metaphor, that draws the general conclusion that when you think about sort of a tailwind or a headwind obviously is something that's blowing in your face, an obstacle, or a tailwind, something that's pushing you forward, that we generally sort of are more aware of the headwinds in our life. We are more aware of the obstacles we face. And the way in which we talk about these obstacles are more nuanced. So we'll talk about, institutional barriers we faced, or people who may have held us back, or situations that didn't go our way. But we're less aware of our tailwinds. We may remember the role of our parents. We may sort of consider one or two things that inspired us, but we're just generally less aware of the tailwinds in our face. And anyone who's, been out bike riding or jogging in a windy situation, that metaphor plays through very well. And the implications of that are pretty significant, because if we're not aware of the tailwinds that move us forward, then we're not supportive and appreciative for those things that have helped us move forward in life. The fortunate sort of piece of this is that what we have found is that if we can get people to stop and reflect on their life, if we can sort of give them an alternative version of their remembered self that actually includes more of the tailwinds that move them forward, that they can actually begin to sort of recapture some of that compassion towards others, that they can be more grateful for the factors that helped move them forward, and that we can actually move towards a much more nuanced and constructive conversation around the American dream and what contributes to it. And that was our goal in the initiative that we created called Moving Up: The Truth About Getting Ahead in America. And we first started, it was pretty simple. It was basically a collection of stories and smattering in of research that was written in a very sort of, inspiring and accessible way that basically walk people through the variety of different factors that research shows help people move up in life, or maybe things that hold them back. And all we wanted to do was to basically sort of, try to say that if we want people to engage on these issues like poverty and equality and opportunity, then we need to find new ways to bring them into the conversation. And it wasn't going to be constructive to either sort of blame people for not working hard enough, or to say that people who were successful were being callous and not compassionate to people who were less. We wanted to try to figure out how do we sort of basically get them to reflect on their own life experience. And so there was this platform that then turned into a newsletter that can be found at movingusa.com, has a couple thousand subscribers. And again, it was just simple questions like, what is your American dream? Or, who would you thank in your Oscar speech? And what we began to see in terms of people who were responding, they were responding, hey, they like them. They were like, these weeklies are quite good. I now look to you and Osteen for my weekly inspiration. But it was also sort of like, hey, this really connected with me. And how I find happiness, and maybe I can use this as a teaching tool with my students. Or, someone who was a lawyer, was all of a sudden thinking like, wait, I wasn't thinking about all of these other factors when I'm sitting in front of someone and I'm doing divorce work. Or, reflecting upon how a parent might have or teacher might have a conversation with a parent that moved beyond test scores and thought more about sort of the bigger picture about the multitude of barriers that may or may not be helping someone move ahead. So as we began doing this, we said, like, why is this working, and how are people reacting to this? And we were getting some really moving responses. So this was a post that was written about the movie A Wonderful Life. And someone had responded, "My dad recently passed away, and what you've written below reminded me so beautifully of him." And then she was reflecting on his life. He stayed in our small town, and he built a business, and he raised his family, and made huge differences in other lives in ways both big and small. And she had forgotten that aspect of his story, and this reminded her of it. And maybe that meant that she went into that day with greater compassion or gratitude. Making the invisible visible was something else that was happening. So again, when you think about sometimes the tailwinds that aren't as that we're not quite as aware of, and sometimes they come in the form of maybe sort of institutional or government programs, and how do you actually bring those to life in a way that's meaningful? And so over the course of one November, we were sharing a series of posts that were thanking people behind the programs. And this is a really interesting picture of Claiborne Pell, who was the senator who was the original sponsor for Pell Grants. And if you look at the picture, it was really interesting. I guess he was pretty frugal, so he would take his own old business suits and cut them up and use them as jogging attire. And so when we told the story about Claiborne Pell and his experience and why he decided to sort of like pursue Pell Grants, people began thanking him. "Thank you, Mr. Pell, for helping me with my education, and I thank you. Because of you, I had the opportunities to become an educator." Now, obviously they weren't aware that Claiborne Pell had long passed, but it was this interesting idea of getting people to reflect in a very personal way about something that maybe had been perceived as a sort of cold government program, but now is being sort of brought to them in a way that was personal and real and that they could connect to. And what we were able to also see is that even in those situations where people were reflecting on maybe others they couldn't really agree with, or that they didn't share political views, that there were openings and cracks for better conversation. So this is a post that was written called "I Was Wrong," which was me reflecting upon yelling at my child one day and feeling bad about it, and then making sure that I told her that I was wrong about what I had done. And then sort of sharing that to a recent admission by Speaker Ryan, who had also admitted that he was wrong. And then this person sort of saying that I humbly admit that the example of Ryan paused me to reflect a little bit and to realize that we all had capacity to improve and do better. And what was really great is that these simple sort of moments of reflection could actually create sort of immediate change that was real. And this was, again, a reflection on sort of how I viewed people who were homeless and how maybe I thought I was helping them. In this case, telling a story of how I had purchased a meal for someone who I'd passed in San Francisco. But through the course of that, I went home and told the story to my children, and they asked what his name was. And I had never taken the opportunity to find that out. And so my intention of being sort of a good actor was undermined by the fact that I hadn't even taken the time to sort of connect on a way that was truly human. And when I shared that story, that someone actually then had the same sort of epiphany, that she maybe helped people but had never really connected with them personally. And what we were really sort of understanding in all of this work was that, is that we needed to provide a way in which we could give people tools for discovery, that it was not sort of sufficient to try to just tell someone how to think or that they had these advantages or to question sort of privilege, but to really sort of give them a means by which they could figure it out on their own. And so that led us to the next tool that we developed, which is Your American Dream Score. And essentially what this was a means by which someone in a matter of a couple of minutes could reflect on their own life, and doing so maybe have a change of attitude and beliefs and ultimately behaviors. And so the theory of change behind this, paraphrasing Galileo, was that you cannot teach a man anything, you can only help him find it within himself. So this idea of inquiry over advocacy. So can we actually give someone a very sort of simple tool to that? And we were fortunate to get support from the Ford Foundation and PBS and their Chasing the Dream initiative. We had partners who developed this really great tool that people really engaged with, and Facebook was helpful in terms of making sure that we could get the word out as well. And what we basically looked at were, much like when we looked at those factors that were in the chart earlier about what contributes to the dream, we looked at all the social science and basically had a series of factors that were enabling people to reflect and answer questions on who they were and where they grew up and their parents and their childhood and their health and their education and their luck and their friends and your services and your character and of course your individual effort. So again, we weren't trying to sort of convince people that they didn't work hard. In fact, hard work was central to many of these questions. We were just asking them like, hey, tell us a little bit about your parents. And by checking a few questions, they were able to say like, you know, I didn't realize that the year I was born made a difference, or I didn't realize how much my parents helped me. And basically at the end, they would get a very simple score that would put them in a range that would say, you know, hey, you either had a lot of factors working in your favor or you had factors that working against you. And people were given the opportunities to, you know, you get a personalized summary that includes, you know, here are the factors that helped you and here's the ones that may have held you back. There was the caveat that basically said, hey, you know, obviously your life is personal and we can't speak to the nuances within it, but generally speaking, based on your answers, here's what we're able to sort of figure out. And, you know, so what you were able to sort of see, you know, my score was a 67, you know, meaning that I had, you know, a lot of things that were working against me, but I had a lot of things that were helping me. And since we launched this, you know, a half a year ago, 500,000 people have found their scores, and they find their scores and then they want to learn more. So they visit the site and look at, you know, additional pages. They're spending almost 5 minutes of it on the site. And most importantly, it's generating a lot of really wonderful online conversations where people share their scores and then their friend shares their score and then they talk about it. And so there was this idea that reflection can really invite people in and they can open up about their own life story, and that was critical. And then they would sort of, you know, share their score and ask someone else a question. And then that would get people talking even more. We were fortunate that the media sort of was jumping in, and they were starting to have different conversations that went beyond sort of just the idea of if you work hard, you can make it. And they were telling nuanced stories about my background and how that informed the development of this tool. What was challenging, however, is that, you know, you can't always control the stories that are told. And one example of this that sort of I think is instructive in terms of a positive versus a non-productive conversation was that, you know, when reporters would talk to us about this, they would ask like, oh, is this a privilege quiz? And we'd say, no, it's not, because it talks about hard work and individual initiative and things along those lines. You know, and we know that if we talked about it from privilege, that people would be turned off to it because they would feel as if their effort was being challenged. And yet you see here one publication still did that. And it confirmed our fears because it led people to basically question the validity of the tool. And we'll show you how we were able to mitigate that. What was so powerful, so promising, was that we saw the influence of people having conversation with each other. So this is a woman who, by her Facebook profile, it's really hard to tell whether she's a Republican or a Democrat. She is, however, an ex-Marine and a parent. And she shared, you know, this, and then a conversation in her feed ensued, and you were able to see how there was a good back and forth. And, you know, next thing you know, there were 75 people in her Facebook feed who were having this conversation and who were commenting about it. And there was a really healthy give or take. At one point, someone had made a comment that wasn't positive, and she said, have you even taken this? She goes, because if you don't, I'm going to sort of meet you on Saturday night at that party, and we're going to make you take it, and then we're going to talk about it. So it was really just wonderful to see the nature of dialogue that a simple tool could engender amongst friends. At the same time, we also saw the importance of mediation. And it's so often that when you go into social media and see conversations that sort of go, it's easy to see how quickly they degenerate into name calling or unproductive talks and, you know, my way or the highway kind of thinking. And here you see, you know, someone whose initial thought was, this is such a stupid way to look at the world, as if all accomplishment one makes can be reduced to their privilege or lack thereof. And then we responded by saying, first, thank you for weighing in. And despite the article's title, this isn't really a quiz about privilege at all. Have you taken it? It includes questions about your friends, your work ethic, your character, etc. Hope you get a chance to check it out. To which then he did, and he said, I was worried about the possibilities of clickbait, but I agree that the text of the article was much more nuanced and a reasonable message. And the conversation went on to be much more to being increasingly productive. And that, I think, again, was sort of this idea of providing hope for the ways in which people can reflect on their scores and lead to productive conversations. Now, what we also did to try to generate interest in this, we would occasionally sort of ask people, like, who do you think has, here's what people who are famous that you may respect, here's what their score was. What do you think about that? And so I'll ask a sort of quick poll here, giving some of it away, that you'll see that, there's only a couple options here, that you'll see that there should be a series of different people in terms of, like, who do you think had the highest score. And the highest score means that you had the most things that you had to overcome. And so based on historical data, we were able to go in and see, like, information about their education or their parents or where they grew up with or their health, and be able to, what we think with a certain amount of confidence sort of tell what their score was. And what was fascinating about this was to learn to see how people responded to different historical figures that they respected or that maybe they had questioned. But it was interesting because just in general, we are people who often refer to other people for guideposts. And so this was instructive in terms of giving someone some barometers for, like, how do I fit in? And how is my score validated relative to other challenges? And it gave just another opportunity for a jumping off point. So I'll close poll to share the results with you. And you'll see the majority of people, have that Martin Luther King had the highest American Dream score. And in fact, of this list we have, he's actually in the middle of the pack. Marilyn Monroe's score was an 88, which means that she had literally almost everything working against her, with the exception of the fact that she, I believe, was white. She was white, but I think that's the only factor. And what was interesting about this is that even in the people that we think have struggled, and obviously Martin Luther King is one of them, who has had a lot that he had to overcome. But when you look at his score, and the same thing happened when we looked at Darren Walker, the president of the Ford Foundation, you saw some really fascinating things, which was that, yes, of course, they, there were race issues that they had to overcome, and there were issues related to maybe the socioeconomic conditions that they raised in or their community. But at the same time, you saw they benefited from a strong social network. They were able to get a good education in spite of their background. They, had family members who supported them. They didn't suffer health issues. They were able to benefit from some luck or some government programs that may have helped them along the way. So the thing that was instructive for this was that it was also a way to say, like, even those stories that we've been told that are about, that have that classic sort of like Horatio Alger or rags to riches stories, still had this sort of notion of, no, they actually had some things going for them, and here's the way in which we should make sure we include these things, because they're instructive for others who are seeking to truly take inspiration from those stories. And the other thing you'll have to admit is that what we realized ultimately was that you can create something like this, and as we mentioned before, you start seeing the results, and there's 500,000 people who have taken this, and that's really exciting. You sort of look at the data, and someone's taking it right now in Georgia or whatever. But you also realize these are individual lives, and that when you ask someone to reflect on their life, there's a responsibility with that. So when you see something that where someone was like, well, that was amazingly depressing because their score was an 84, and someone says, same here, or 84, it's been a really rough road, you realize that there is a sense of responsibility to sort of provide some guidance, or to give them some reason for hope, or at least some admiration for what they've had to go through. And we've done that with the fact that the score, the higher, was reflective of the challenges. The songs that people receive, when you find your score, you'll find that, a song that sort of epitomized your journey is also sort of shared with you. So there was this sort of notion, and there are resources that we also provide after someone finds their score, if you want to learn more about what's going on, that you can do that. So, What we realized that was sort of also happening as we were sort of developing this is that we were basically this was the tip of the iceberg. That it was one thing to give someone an online quiz that they could take and share on Facebook, but there were a lot of different ways in which, if we truly want to have a better conversation around the American dream, that we should begin to consider what else we can do. And some of this stuff I think will be relevant for your work. Some was this idea of like, wait, is there an opportunity to train the trainer? So we were noticing, through some of the people we work with in criminal justice, that people would often tell stories about how judges would actually use sort of like, you should have pulled yourself up from your bootstraps, or you're an adult, you're responsible for your actions. That they would use the same narrative in sentencing discussions. So people were saying like, well, is this an opportunity to make sure that people who are dealing with folks in various systems, that they actually at least have a greater appreciation for the lived experience of the person who is in front of them, that enables them to have an understanding in a way that's not, as it currently is, subjective, and is more objective, saying like, Your Honor, my client, he's had 11 out of the 13 factors we know are helpful for helping moving out of poverty working against him. People are talking to us about exploring ways in which we can use this as an assessment tool for people who come into the social services center and say, hey, we want to make sure you understand how you ended up here. We know that you obviously are familiar with some of the things that have been holding you back, but let's talk about maybe some of the things that you can still do. How do you build your social network, which we know people who are disadvantaged often don't feel comfortable within their network asking people for help who may be in a position to help them. Or let's talk about some of the research around education and how that can help you. Let's talk about some of the things that may have contributed to how you ended up here, so you don't feel as bad, and that you don't feel as if you should buy into the bill of goods that you're here because it's your fault. Others have talked to us about using the tool for diversity workshops. So obviously we know there's a lot of interesting work that's being done around racial diversity and gender diversity, but what's interesting is that one organization at one point, they were working and taking the tool, and they said that we think there might be something broken about the tool because all of our staff are getting the same score, around 60. And our response is that the tool is working fine, but your staff may not be especially diverse, which could be problematic in that you are creating tools and content for people whose lived experience your workforce doesn't have a direct experience with. We want to try to figure out how do we tell better stories. So we're hoping to develop podcasts in the future where we can ask people to find their score and then take them through that journey. So imagine what might happen if you were able to sit down with an interview with Paul Ryan and Nancy Pelosi, and they talked about their backgrounds and were able to connect in a way that maybe they haven't thus far. October 18th is the birthday of James Truslow Adams, who is the person who first coined the term American Dream. And we're hoping to establish an American Dream Day where we have an event that can bring us all together, either virtually or in a spot, and have these kinds of conversation about what really contributes to the American dream. And then we're also having ways in which we want to rethink some of the narratives that continue to sort of be told, and say like, is there a way in which we can make them more nuanced? So having written an alternative version to the Little Engine that looks at different engines and their different experiences trying to climb that hill. What we have talked about today in terms of some of the psychology behind the tool and the way we think about moving in life is just the tip of the iceberg, and there's still so much to learn. There's learning from our own information that we've collected, probably the largest database of data on people reflecting on factors that have helped them move up. There are doing different kinds of studies, like the one I mentioned before, to say like, if you get people to reflect on their life, can that actually make change? And one of those opportunities we're exploring with a professor at Harvard whose work is on charitable giving. And she has found separately that people who believe that their success is largely through their own efforts give less and are less charitable than people who have a more a deeper understanding of those factors that contribute to them. So could the tool or insight from the tool lead to actual increases in charitable giving? And finally, we're actually taking this in the classroom. So PBS has developed curriculum around the tool that is available to high schools around the country as part of civics education. And we are teaching this as a class at the Parsons School of Design here in New York, where students will be creating content and try to find different ways in which they can redesign the American dream and create content that can tell a better story and lead to better conversations. So that's a little bit about our journey and what we've learned about the American dream, and some of the things that we have in store. I want to thank everyone for joining. I think I'm going to turn it over now